The Trump administration is slashing essential projects that deal with cheap and clean energy, disproportionately targeting blue cities. Congressman Sean Casten from the great state of Illinois joins me to talk about why, one, some of the people that are the most impacted are actually not Democrats, it's Republicans. It's red voters, people that are also being impacted by the big bullshit bill, the government shutdown, the fact that the Republicans refuse to renew subsidies that expire when it comes to healthcare at the end of 2025. Congressman Casten also talks about what's going on in his home state of Illinois. The federalization of National Guard troops to be able to be basically invading cities like Chicago, and why it destroys the public's trust in law enforcement and hurts public safety. And joining me now is Congressman Sean Casten, representing the great state of Illinois and specifically District 6. You know, Congressman, I'd say, are you busy? And the answer would be yes, but at least you're not with the Republicans working on your tan.
I think all of us feel right now like we got elected to be members of Congress, and increasingly we need to be therapists because everybody's asking what the heck is going on. Can I trust ICE? Can I trust a contract with the federal government to be honored? And we're trying to do our best we can to do damage control. And in the meantime, trying to remind Mike Johnson that we actually are supposed to be in D.C. and working right now, even though he'd like to be on vacation.
Well, and let's be clear, Mike Johnson, the Speaker of the House, has basically told Republicans not to come to work, right?
Yeah. And I mean, I think we all have our theories. Certainly the fact that we now have enough votes to force the discharge of the vote on the Epstein resolution has got to be a part of that. But you do sit there and say, yes, we're in a shutdown. That's a concern. But at the same time, you know, the National Flood Insurance Program authorization lapsed. The authorizations for telehealth lapsed. We could be doing things right now that really matter and would protect us in a crisis. And instead they're saying, let's just not come to DC because God forbid we do oversight on the executive branch.
And that's the thing that I keep on trying to underscore, because I'm the first to admit that we're living in an incredibly polarized time politically. And it is sad because I do think that everybody is hurting, especially in the context of a government shutdown, regardless of your political affiliation. But the gamesmanship seems to be on hyper overdrive for Republicans when it comes to trying to make this an even more politicized moment. I wanted to actually just kick off with you, Congressman. I think an incredibly powerful letter that you signed off on from October 7th to the Secretary of Energy, Chris Wright, which talks about the termination by the Department of Energy of 321 financial awards supporting 223 projects that support energy resilience across the country. And it's amazing because by cutting these programs, the Republicans are trying to make it seem like they're saving money. But in reality, all Americans, regardless of their party affiliation, are going to get punished by this move.
Well, yeah. So this is $8 billion worth of projects. They are heavily dominated, but not exclusively in Democratic districts.
Oh, that sounds like a coincidence to me.
Yeah. Every one of these projects will lead to lowering the cost of energy because it's all projects that are designed to deploy the cheap energy revolution, which is solar and wind and geothermal and all of these renewables that don't cost anything to operate. And you look at Chris Wright, who makes his money by producing expensive energy. He doesn't particularly like competition. He doesn't do very well in a competitive environment. It's part of why they're so hostile to DEI. These guys need to swim in the shallow end of the pool. But by cutting that, as we sit here at the same time saying there's this surge of data centers, loads are growing, what are we going to do to meet load? I mean, I'm told that they care about permitting reform, and yet they're blocking these projects from coming online, which is only going to raise energy costs, is only going to reduce reliability. And, I think more broadly and more perniciously, I hate that we even have to say this, but if you were a business and you signed a contract with the federal government of the United States, would you trust that they would honor it in this moment?
No.
Right?
That's the short answer.
And why do we even have to ask that question? If you look at this, the billions of dollars of investment by Ørsted, a Danish company, in revolutionary wind, and for that to be shut down 80% through and not be able to bring it online now, they've gone through in the courts and tried to bring it back. These are foreign countries that under the Biden administration committed massive investments in the United States to the benefit of every one of us as Americans. and now they're not there. That's not just a Democratic district issue. That's all of us as Americans. That puts the risk on an economy that we have built over decades that we should be very proud of, and is being destroyed in a matter of months by the Trump administration.
I kind of want to underscore this point that you made, though, just so it's not lost, frankly. There is a disproportionate impact on blue cities from the slashing of things like these programs, right?
There undoubtedly is, but keep in mind when we say blue cities, I represent a district that I think Kamala Harris won my district by 3 points. Mm-hmm. It's blue in the sense that she won the district, but I got a lot of Trump voters I represent. They're also getting hurt. I think last time I checked, 2.4 million people in Illinois voted for Donald Trump. That's about 5 times the population of Wyoming. We are all Americans. We are all expected when we win elected office to represent everybody in the areas we represent, not just the ones who voted for us. And the thing that has made America great is that we have seen ourselves as bigger. I remind people in my town halls all the time of Thomas Paine, who said our great title is as Americans, our lesser title is our local state. It's by our great title we're known abroad. It's by our lesser title we're known at home. Donald Trump is emphasizing our lesser titles. And he's doing things that haven't been done really since the Civil War to try to turn some Americans against each other's because of a 51-49% swing in the vote one way or the other in one state or one jurisdiction. It's massively dangerous.
And I'm glad, though, that your response to my inquiry pretty much proves the point, which is there may be the intent, malevolently so, to target a, quote, blue city, but there are Republicans that are being directly impacted by these cuts. The government shutdown is also not just looking for Democratic targets, it's actually looking for many federal workers, et cetera. One thing I wanted to ask you about the shutdown, we're on day, 7? Congressman, of this. You, for example, are going to do a town hall because constituents, they want to know what the hell is going on. Nobody knows what's happening. I said, there's some inconveniences, I guess we could call them, that are happening right now. But there's things like millions of Americans, at least 5 million that are currently having ACA marketplace health insurance, for example. When those subsidies expire at the end of 2025, they're going to lose their health insurance coverage. The subsidies are going to skyrocket. And that was just one thing that the Democrats were looking for in order to keep the government open.
You've hit it on the head. The uncertainty about what happens on that front. There's other things like the authorization for telehealth, which we made during COVID to make sure that people who had mobility issues, or maybe you're in a rural area where there's not as many hospitals, which, by the way, there's fewer of now because of the cuts in the big ugly bill. It's really helpful to be able to meet with your doctor electronically with telehealth. People have raved about that. That authorization went away. The White House could choose to keep that going and reimburse people on the back end. And we're hearing stories that they are now no longer providing that. So now you're sitting there, even if you have health insurance, not being able to access it because of conscious choices being made by this White House that somehow they think that if they create enough pain for individual Americans, maybe that will accrue to their political advantage. I don't get it. The first thing you learn when you get into politics is that politics is the art of addition. And these folks seem to think that if you run on division, maybe you can counter that. I don't think it's true. And I think they know it's not true, which is why they're trying to redistrict all across the country, because they know that what they're doing ain't popular.
True, because if it was, then you wouldn't have to sit there and rig stuff through redistricting in Texas and in other states. I want to focus on the dollars because, frankly, sometimes I feel like that penetrates to the, quote, other side when we're having these conversations. So let's look at these numbers, right? By not extending the subsidies that are going to expire at the end of 2025, premiums will increase by more than 75% in 2026. And when they get to be that unaffordable, an additional 4.2 million Americans could lose their health insurance coverage. And that's not from Katie Phang. That's from the Congressional Budget Office estimates. And then you look at citations that you included in your letter to the Secretary of Energy, where all constituents, regardless of political affiliations, are looking at household electric bills increasing at least 10% nationally since when? Since Trump took office in January of 2025. Everything is more expensive. I don't have to tell anybody who's tuning in right now, sir, how expensive things are getting. And yet I see continued construction on that freaking ballroom, right? At the White House. And I see, plans for a UFC cage match on the White House lawn for next year. I mean, these things aren't stopping, but Americans are supposed to shoulder the financial burden of Trump and the Republicans' whims.
Yeah, you mentioned 70% there. I've seen other estimates of as much as 115% increase in insurance. And that's if your insurance company still provides. They may not
Even be around. Yeah.
I think a consistent theme out of the Trump White House, and this, I think this is maybe a bipartisan criticism, is it's always been lonely to argue for competitive markets, to try to create an environment where entrepreneurs can come up and compete, because incumbent businesses never really like that. And that's hard regardless of who's in power. But what you're seeing with this Trump White House is we absolutely don't want to have competition that would do anything to disrupt incumbents. So let's block transmission lines that we're bringing cheap wind from Midwestern states, cheap wind power into more densely populated urban areas. That's bad for incumbent utilities in those densely populated urban areas, because then they have to compete against cheaper power. It's really good for those rural states, right? You have, they're saying that we've screwed up our tariff policy so badly that now we need to find a way to steal money from some non-congressionally appropriated fund to give money to farmers. That ain't competition. This is communist central planning that they're doing, right? And the irony of this is that pain is most heavily going to be felt in rural and redder America, right? That's where the biggest pains of these Medicaid cuts are, because they're the places that don't have as many rural hospitals to begin with. I did town halls in downstate Illinois back last spring, and I had farmers in full MAGA regalia who said that they had shown up because their representative wasn't doing town halls, and they wanted to make sure I understood the difficulty they were having trying to figure out what to plant when 60% of our soy crop is exported and 60% of our exports go to China, and China competes on the penny between the US and Brazil. And now here we are with those same farmers in red America being hurt because Donald Trump had this sort of third grade 1890s economic theory, and third grade qualified economic advisors like Peter Navarro saying, yeah, let's go back to tariffs. Right? This is the opposite of competitive markets. And we're all paying the price for their economic illiteracy right now.
Well, I'm going to stake my claim to a follow-up conversation with you, Congressman, once they actually pull the trigger on the bailout, quote unquote, funding, after we send $20 billion to Argentina, who then play us vis-a-vis the soybean sale to China. Any bailout, I don't think the money exists, frankly, but any tariff bailout for our American farmers is never going to fix the problem. It's not going to fix the market. It's only going to be a temporary Band-Aid on a hemorrhaging wound. But you and I will have that conversation once that actually happens. I want to focus, though, on the clean energy agenda. How can you possibly, and by the way, I support it, so this question definitely is not rhetorical. How can you support this when it's so obvious that Trump and the Republicans, A, have a billionaire bromance going on with all people of wealth and the elite that way, but B, they clearly are only advancing fossil fuels. They reversed EPA regulations. They pretty much are making it a bad word to think about clean energy.
Well, so I'd change one word in your question. This isn't a clean energy agenda. It's a cheap energy agenda.
Oh, but it ends up being clean. So look at it. It's a double win. It's like BOGO, isn't it not?
No, but I say that because those two terms are synonymous. And I think to understand what Trump and Secretary Wright and Burgum are doing, you need to understand that they're not hostile to clean energy. They're hostile to cheap energy. In April of 2020, when the price of gasoline was collapsing because of the economic freefall of COVID, Donald Trump called the Saudis and said, we're going to withdraw military aid from Saudi Arabia unless you clamp back on oil production to raise the price of oil, because this is killing American oil producers. Donald Trump really did that, and the Saudis flinched and the price of oil went up. At the end of the Biden administration, the Biden White House had ruled under the 1935 Natural Gas Act, they are directed not to approve natural gas export facilities unless it's in the national interest. And the Biden administration looked at those numbers and said, if we export more natural gas in the United States, there will be less supply in the United States. That will raise prices for consumers, and so we shouldn't approve these facilities. The Trump White House immediately reversed that, and the price of gas subsequently went up. We're now actually generating more power from coal than we were before Trump came in, not because coal is displacing renewables. They're still growing. It's because coal is now, for the first time in a long time, cheaper than gas because they've managed to raise the price of gas.
Oh, gosh.
The reason why they're pushing to raise the price of gas is because U.S. oil and gas producers want the price to be high. That's fine, right? If I was selling shoes, I'd rather sell shoes for $100 than $20. There's nothing wrong with that from a business perspective. But the Trump administration is consistently prioritizing producers who want the cost to be high over consumers who want the price to be low. The single cheapest thing you can do the single best thing you can do to lower price for consumers is deploy clean energy. Solar power didn't cost anything. Wind power doesn't cost anything. Geothermal doesn't cost anything. A well-insulated home doesn't cost you gas to heat. A car that runs on electricity doesn't cost you gasoline to fuel. You've got to put up the capital, of course, to do this. But as you deploy that capital, you lower the cost of energy. And that is a massive threat to people like Chris Wright. So markets know what they want. What they're doing is going back and pushing back against this. Mike Levin and I have just introduced a fairly sizable bill, the Cheap Energy Act, specifically to say, let's better align the interests of energy producers so that there isn't an economic conflict between producers and consumers, because we're actually big into markets and capitalism. But again, when half the population statistically is below average, and you got a lot of below average people in the White House, they're not really keen on meritocracies.
But instead of prioritizing cheap energy and advancing legislation that would be a financial benefit to the American consumers, that would perhaps strike that balance that you're seeking, which would allow for capitalism and the markets to boom, but also not make it so cost prohibitive that we literally can't afford it as the consumers. Instead, we have Trump federalizing Illinois National Guard members to be deployed in Chicago, federalizing Texas National Guard with the blessing of Greg Abbott to send them to Chicago, to send them to Portland, to send them to California. I mean, that is the priority. I don't have to tell you, Congressman, your state is under siege. And unfairly so. And I don't even think that you have to be a fan of J.B. Pritzker to understand why he now has to go to court like Gavin Newsom did and like the state of Oregon had to, right? To be able to stake a claim to state sovereignty so that people like Trump and the Trump administration don't overflex their federal powers over states that have capacity to handle what's happening. I covered what happened on the south side of Chicago last week with that early morning raid. And people are horrified. I'm sure you're hearing from your constituents that they're legitimately worried to even leave their homes these days because they don't know what's going to happen to them.
There's huge fear. There's fear not only of leaving their homes. There's fear of, I've had people, come up to me and say, I'm a born citizen of the United States, but I have a Spanish surname. Do I need to carry my passport around with me? If I see someone,
well, they don't care about that either. They're just looking for brown people at this point.
Yeah, but the fact that they have to ask that question and live with that fear, and also the fact that we've got the filing that Governor Pritzker just made relies in part on the Posse Comitatus Act, which was a law that was passed in the wake of the Civil War because Southern states did not want federal troops to come down and enforce the laws of the United States. This is insane, that history. And so now we have states saying, no, the law that was passed to protect the interests of essentially the slavery interests, we're now saying you can't send federal troops in here under that law. So Trump is not flexing his power. He's breaking the law.
Yeah.
And in the meantime, I don't want to overstate this case, but this is just all about racism and xenophobia. If you look at all of the statistics, documented immigrants to the United States commit crimes at a lower rate than natural-born citizens. Undocumented immigrants create crimes at a lower rate than documented immigrants. That's entirely unsurprising. Those folks are pretty vulnerable. The last thing they want to do is get caught. And what Trump is doing is sort of like if you told all the police in your town to put all their efforts on, I don't know, enforcing underage drinking. We know underage drinking happens, but if you pull police off other activities, that means that more crime is going to happen. And so now we're seeing a collapse in drug interdictions. I recently met with the ATF office in Chicago, who said that they're on a complete hiring freeze. So as people retire, they can't replace them. So our ability to do things to stop real crimes from happening, gun seizures, drug seizures, chase down the drug traffickers, the Trump administration is not providing resources to that, not to mention white collar crime. But instead, they're chasing these, what are at best low-level, minor, victimless crimes of someone came here to study in school and, fell in love, had a kid, the relationship fell apart, and now they're sitting there saying, okay, I'm undocumented, but I'm not hurting anybody. And that's the crimes that they're prosecuting. So it's all making us less safe and reducing trust in law enforcement, which doesn't accrue to any of our benefits.
But then I call it the big bullshit bill. I won't impute it to you, sir, but I call it the big bullshit bill, but then you can have $100-something million towards ICE. I mean, you can't, because I do think, and I'd love to know your take on this, I think public safety is an incredibly powerful concept that has no party affiliation. And I think what we're seeing here is a heightened risk of decreasing public safety when things like this happen. When you take 300 Illinois National Guard troops and put them in Chicago, when you take them away from other stuff they can be doing, when you basically send a message to local and state law enforcement that they're incompetent because they can't handle what's happening in their own cities.
So I represent I represent communities in Chicago where an awful lot of Chicago cops and firefighters live. So I spend a fair amount of time with that community. And obviously we all contain multitudes, but for the most part, those folks really don't want to be in a position of being forced to enforce federal laws because they know that they do their job better if they have the trust of their local communities.
Exactly.
You want to be able to walk down the street and have somebody say, hey, I know there's some bad gang activity that's going to come. I want to get you alerted, and not fear that to share that information is going to force the police officer to ask you other questions about your immigration status or something else. So it makes us all less safe when you do that. To repeat the point I was making before, if you now have big chunks of folks in Chicago saying, when I see somebody wearing a uniform that looks like law enforcement and is carrying a firearm and appears to have the jurisdiction to use deadly force, should I trust that that person is applying the law equally, or should I trust that that person has a political agenda? Nobody is safer if people start to come to that second conclusion. Which means that we're now creating a situation not only where our streets are less safe for us, but our streets are less safe for law enforcement who's trying to do their job.
Well, and it doesn't escape anybody's common sense notice that they're not deploying the National Guard to cities in Texas, for example, which has their own issues involving crime. Before you and I part ways, Congressman, I kind of wanted to ask you about something that's a little nuanced that I noted in your letter to Secretary Wright at the Department of Energy, because you mentioned it a few times, and it's China. And it talks about giving and ceding ground to China to obtain a strategic edge as China and other nations continue to innovate and build energy technologies of the future. It's kind of a two-prong concept for you. One, it's not only the slashing of funding of these financial awards that are helping these projects, which would build American strength and kind of superiority in these spaces, but it's also speaking to this idea that we are also being viewed by our allies now with wariness, but our opponents, our foes, they're our enemies, if I may. Retired Lieutenant General Mark Hertling and I had a conversation after that disastrous Quantico thing, and he said, Katie, you have to see what your foes and your opponents are watching us right now and what they're thinking about us. Your thoughts on, even in this space and in the energy space, cheap energy, clean energy, how somebody like China, who's such a powerhouse, is looking at us and basically laughing at us, saying, look, you guys are pulling money and we're going to basically drink your milkshake at this point.
Well, so, whether they're laughing at us, I think they can't believe their good fortune. That the United States, was in a position under the Biden administration. When we passed the Inflation Reduction Act, I met with the head of the UN,
Mm.
who told me that a lot of the developing world was somewhat upset with the United States because the Inflation Reduction Act was causing so much capital to flow into the United States that used to flow to the developing world to build manufacturing plants, to build clean energy industries, and that was hurting the developing world's access to capital. And here, just a few months later, you now have the White House driving all that capital to go look for someplace else to live. And so, I was in Frankfurt, Germany last November. All the buses are electric buses manufactured by BYD. Germany is not buying electric buses because they're woke. They're buying electric buses because they're cheaper and they want to save money. You don't see American-made electric cars driving around the streets there, but you do see Mercedes and BMWs and Volvos, and I guess Volvo is a U.S. manufacturer. But you take my point, and lots of BYDs. The solar panels, if we're not going to invest in them here, if we're not going to invest in the batteries here, which, by the way, those technologies almost exclusively came out of U.S. labs. Argonne National Lab in my district is the home of most battery chemistry technology. Now we're going to build those overseas. We're basically setting up our competitors to be successful in that environment. And then on top of that, we have the United States saying, well, I don't really want to be the defender of the post-World War II order and the rule of law anymore. That's music not only to China's ears, but also to Russia's.
Russia.
Because if we step back from being in a position of leadership on the global stage, it's not that leadership doesn't happen. It's that someone else steps into that void. And so this anti-market support antiquated technology, I sometimes liken their approach to saying, it's almost as if the U.S. invented cell phones and then the U.S. government decided to double down and subsidize rotary phone export technology.
Well, it's a pretty good comparison. I mean, if this is an America First agenda, it's the worst one I've heard of, frankly.
Yeah.
Well, Congressman Sean Casten, as always, it's an illuminating conversation with you. I appreciate your efforts to continue to work through this government shutdown to provide information through your teletown hall for constituents and others. I know it's an incredibly important part of your role as an elected in D.C. And I'll be frank, I've had frustration with some electeds in D.C. as of late, but people like you and others, y'all are still fighting the good fight. And so we're incredibly grateful. And thank you for taking the time to educate us and get us kind of caught up to speed on everything. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you. And just would ask everybody to lean in. America survives because we all fight for it, not because we count on other people to do it. So thank you for what you do as well.
Thank you, sir. Katie Phang here. We launched the Katie Phang News Channel in partnership with the Midas Touch Network so we could bring you the latest in legal and political news. Straight, no chaser. So if you're a fellow truth teller, hit that subscribe button and share the word about this channel so we can build a high information America together.